Swinburne has a divided mind view of Christ's incarnation. That is, Christ is one person, but has two distinct centers of consciousness within one mind. That is, he has the human consciousness and he has the divine consciousness. Now you may recall the divine consciousness is the larger set. It contains all true beliefs because in his divinity, he's omniscient. And then the restricted set are what he calls a separate system of semi-beliefs. What are semi-beliefs? Well, they're the beliefs he would have if he didn't have the divine beliefs. They're the beliefs that come through, like the rest of us, our senses, our eyes, our touch, our hands, our memory, perception, and so on. So Christ has two distinct centers of consciousness. But this raised the problem. What happens when divine Christ in his consciousness believes that P, someone is alive, and then other Christ in his human consciousness believes that not P, that the person is not alive? That is, it looks like if we divide Christ's mind, we may solve the problem of how God can become incarnate and truly have a human experience, but it looks like he's going to have conflicting beliefs. And then which belief actually wins out? Well, in order to solve this problem, Swinburne introduces the concept of semi-belief. And semi-belief it's a little bit of a confusing concept. Why? Because it's hard to find exactly what Swinburne's talking about. I did a little research, and in his book, Epistemic Justification, he refers to the term semi-beliefs, and there he's talking about beliefs that have a relatively high credence, but not enough to be more probable than not. So like maybe you believe something to 40%. So it's not a full-blown belief because you don't believe it's more probable than not, but you have some probability that's not zero or low in the proposition. But so there's that. But then the question is, how can semi-beliefs that Christ believes in his human consciousness be action guiding? So remember, his human consciousness guides him in all his interactions when he's on earth, and his ministry and all that he did during that time he was incarnate on earth. But then how can a proposition that he believes only to a degree that it's not more likely than not, that is, he believes it to a degree that's less than 50%, so he doesn't even think it's likely, more likely than not, how could that guide Christ's actions? And then when I look in other places, like the Christian God, which is where he fully articulates things, then you see that semi-beliefs are switched out with dispositions to believe. So they're not full-fledged beliefs. They're actually just a disposition to form a belief. So all that to say, I even put it out there on some Swinburne fan pages and analytical theists, and so far no one's gotten back to me. So it's not exactly clear what Swinburne has in mind. It does seem like a problematic notion, but the big picture idea, setting aside what the terminology is and how to correctly cash it out, the big picture idea is that the divine mind, the divine consciousness, there's only one mind, it's easy to slip between that. The divine consciousness only has true beliefs and has the full picture of reality. Whereas the human consciousness has a limited set of beliefs, and it will include things like false beliefs, will not only be limited, Christ can grow in knowledge, Christ can have a truly human experience given his human consciousness, feel all the things that humans feel, and yet those little beliefs just help him in this limited sense. So they're not a full picture of reality. They're just what he gets from having a body and having a fully human experience. But now you might wonder, so this solves the problem of like how Christ can look like us and feel like us and have a truly human experience and not be accessing all true beliefs while he's in his human consciousness here on earth. So he can be limited in that way. But then you might say, could God incarnate have done wrong? Like, for instance, if Christ in his human consciousness can have false beliefs or limited beliefs, then it seems like Christ could accidentally do the wrong thing. And if Christ can do the wrong thing, then Christ perhaps isn't sinless. But it's a core Christian teaching that Christ was sinless. So how does Swinburne work around this problem? And again, this is we're pulling from Was Jesus God as our main text. But of course, as I mentioned, I'm supplementing it by trying to sift through and pull things in from other sources. So what Swinburne says is basically there are two types of wrong. There's objective and subjective. So objective wrong for him is just failing in your obligations and your duties, basically whether you realize it or not. It's a fact of the matter that you failed to do what you should have done morally. For like for instance, if you took money from someone and you didn't realize it was their money, you just found some money and you took it, you didn't realize it was another person's, well, objectively speaking, you did the wrong thing. You took another person's money, but you didn't realize that that's what you were doing. So in a sense, these kind of wrongs, these objective wrongs, can often be less morally troubling and problematic. Whereas if you knew that that was someone else's money and you still took it, that is subjective wrong. You were aware of what you were doing under the description of it being wrong to do it. Then you weren't in ignorance. You were acting out of knowledge, and you're in some sense more culpable because you knowingly did the thing. And you find this in Scripture, right, where the harsher penalty is for someone who knowingly does the wrong thing as perhaps accidentally doing the wrong thing out of just not ignorance. They just lack some knowledge, and they probably wouldn't have done the thing if they'd have known what they were actually doing was morally wrong. Now, how does this relate back to the incarnation? Well, he says, quote, "Now it would have been wrong of a divine person to allow himself to become incarnate in such a way as to open himself up to the possibility of his doing objective or subjective wrong. For it is wrong of anyone to put themselves in a position where they're liable to do wrong to someone. So like intentionally allow themselves to forget their duties or to take drugs, which would lead to their being strongly tempted to do some wrong, or simply be unable to stop themselves from doing wrong." End quote. So here the classic example is drunk driving. It's wrong. Maybe it's not wrong in the moment to just have a few drinks. But if you keep drinking, then you put yourself in a position such that you could, if you were to get behind the wheel, you could do major damage and you wouldn't even know that you were doing it. So it's wrong to put yourself in that situation to get, say, super drunk or blackout drunk, when doing so would actually open you up to the possibility of doing horrible objective and perhaps subjective wrong. So how would this relate to God? Well, he says that God must have ensured in becoming incarnate that he wouldn't be subject to too strong of a desire to do wrong. So like Christ was tempted, right? In his human consciousness, he may have experienced temptation and genuinely been pulled perhaps to do the wrong thing. But he may even have believed he might succumb to the temptation. So that's the full human experience, right? And so in that moment when he's being tempted, Christ could have felt very much like we feel when we're tempted to do the wrong thing. And so because it would have been wrong for God to put Christ in a situation where he was actually liable to do wrong, then God, being perfectly good, wouldn't have done that. So the fact that God put Christ in this situation suggests that there was a sense that Christ actually couldn't have done genuine wrong. Now, perhaps, Swinburne notes, Christ could have not done the best thing, but we don't want to say that he ever actually did wrong, because it doesn't follow that because you don't do the very best, the optimal action in a particular situation, that therefore you've done a wrong action. So what Swinburne notices is even if it's wrong to put yourself in a situation where you might do wrong, you're prone to do wrong, he says, quote, there's nothing wrong in putting oneself in a position where one is liable not to do the best action, or equal best or equal best kind of action, or even a bad action, if there are any bad actions that are not wrong. He says, indeed, an action which had the foreseen consequence of putting oneself in that position might itself occasionally be the best thing to do. Okay, now that might be actually irrational, but a perfectly free person like God wouldn't be subject to irrational desires, to just like spontaneously give away all your money, or to just be overboard with your generosity, go way above and beyond the call of duty, even if it meant later you don't have any money to actually do a similar thing in the future. So what he now says is, well, we have to actually qualify what we mean by free person. So he says, quote, I now define a perfectly free person as one subject to no irrational desires, except insofar as, uninfluenced by such desires, he chooses to allow himself to act while being influenced by such desires, though not compelled to yield to them, end quote. So now what do we see? Well, God in perfect freedom could allow Christ to be incarnated, take on voluntarily, in addition to his divine consciousness, a human consciousness that's limited and tied to the body in terms of the beliefs it attains. And by doing that, he may freely, remember, Christ freely chose to limit himself, to condescend, and by doing that, he allowed himself to be open to temptation, even if he wasn't actually compelled to yield to them. So he might have been tempted and have felt like he could. He might have even believed he could succumb to temptation. But in fact, God freely chose to do that, knowing that Christ wouldn't actually be compelled to yield to the temptation. As such, Christ would never actually do wrong. So he would actually then need to fight against the temptation. So he might, at a moment, put himself in a situation where he's tempted to do a less than best action, say, and then he's got to fight against that temptation not to do the best action. And it may have even been, as he says, quote, possible that he would yield to the temptation and done instead a less good action, and perhaps even a bad action, though certainly not a wrong action. He might choose to put himself in the situation of temptation of this kind in order to share our human condition as fully as possible. If in his human consciousness, God incarnate were on occasion subject to a balance of desire, a strong temptation, not to do the best action, then his overcoming this temptation would be a free act for which he would be praiseworthy, end quote. So Christ might, in his just human consciousness, not be aware. Remember, he doesn't have access to his divine consciousness. He may have some sense that he's divine because, remember, he proclaimed his divinity, right? But he may not have fully had access. We didn't, on this model, have full access to the contents of the divine consciousness. And so in that moment, he would have felt tempted to do a less than best action. And even though if he couldn't have actually done a bad action, because God wouldn't have, it would have been wrong of God to put him in a situation where he could have actually done an objective or subjective wrong. That's not the case. But then Christ had to fight against that temptation to do less than the best in order to do the best action. And in that sense, he's praiseworthy. That is, he went above and beyond the call of duty. He did something using his freedom that we as humans have to do. We have to use our freedom in order to overcome temptations to do less than the best action. But for us, it's a live possibility that we do wrong actions. But for Christ, that wasn't actually a live possibility. So, to close out, he says, being divine, he must remain perfectly free, but he could, in perfect freedom, because of perfect goodness of doing so, allow himself to make a choice under the influence of a desire to do a lesser good. God incarnate could not do wrong. He could, nevertheless, feel as we do when we're tempted to do wrong. And he could have been tempted to do acts other than the best ones available. He could have yielded to these latter temptations, and if he did any supererogatory acts, he would probably do them by resisting such temptations. End quote. So I'd love to hear your thought. What do you think about Swinburne's view of the Incarnation? Do you think this works? I mean, it takes a lot of sort of walking a fine line to make sense of this, but Swinburne has made sense of how Christ can not have contradictory beliefs because his beliefs that are in his human consciousness are not full-blown beliefs, they're semi-beliefs. So even if he holds a contrary belief to what he has in his divine consciousness, it's not a genuine conflict because the other belief isn't full-fledged, it's just semi. So he's overcome that problem. And then it looks like, well, wait, if he has a human consciousness, can he do wrong? And Swinburne says, no, it would have been wrong for God to put Christ in the situation to do wrong. He couldn't do wrong, but yet, how could Christ have our experience and be tempted if he couldn't do wrong? Well, Christ could have freely been put in a situation where he was tempted, couldn't have actually done wrong, but was tempted to do less than the best, and actually had to fight against that temptation in order to do what was best, or he could have even succumbed and done the less best action. And so even if he couldn't have actually done wrong, then he still could feel like us when we have to wrestle against temptation, and it's actually a live option for us to do subjective or objective wrong. I hope this series on Swinburne on the Incarnation has been a blessing. I've really enjoyed wrestling through it. I'd love to hear your thoughts. What do you think about Swinburne's account? Make sure to like and subscribe. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, do all the YouTube-y stuff, and I wish you the best. Much peace and love in Christ.